evening and welcome. I'm Harold Holzer, and I have the privilege of serving as the director of Roosevelt House. And on behalf of Jennifer Rabb, the president of Hunter College, I'm delighted to welcome you to this exploration of a wonderful book called Unlikely Heroes. Something I'm going to say at all of our events from now until the end of June. President Rabb, who's leaving Hunter College on June 30th, not only saved this house, but practically dug this auditorium herself. If she had had to use a spoon, she would have dug this auditorium. This was the the Roosevelt family kitchens. It only went to about this level. But when she saved this house and restored it and repurposed it, she determined that there needed to be a public gathering space. And if not for that, we wouldn't be meeting here. Needless to say, I wouldn't be here. So, eternal gratitude to Jennifer for what she did. And those of you who came in you had to come in through the lobby, I suppose, saw the exhibition, which is almost completely installed, on the history of Roosevelt House. Take a look when we go upstairs, and have a special look when we're at the reception honoring Derek Liebart and at the book sale upstairs, because you'll see a wall that has just been installed marking President Rabb's various welcomings of distinguished guests. And you'll see the Dalai Lama, the Secretary General, Jane Fonda, Bill Clinton, Hillary. It's just been an extraordinary 13 years in this house. So that's the explanation for all of the photos and texts and original things upstairs. It's for an exhibition that's opening May 25th. So come back on May 25th, by the way, for a discussion of that show. Well, what's special about tonight is not only that it's one of the final events of this semester, but because it explores 4 Roosevelt lieutenants and the world they helped Roosevelt make. And one of them in particular has a special connection to Roosevelt House. FDR, of course, recovered from polio here and conducted his presidential transition here. And here, 90 years ago, Frances Perkins came in for her, the most consequential job interview in history, to be considered as the first woman in a presidential cabinet, and then set her own conditions for accepting the job, that Roosevelt would allow her to pursue what we know as the social safety net, including Social Security, all created upstairs in the library. So this should be an interesting, very interesting discussion. I will give you one other Roosevelt House prelude, and that is that the book touches on the Tehran conference of 1943, so 80 years ago. And when that conference was almost taking place, let me tell it from a slightly different angle. Roosevelt had sold this building to Hunter College, and he was scheduled to hand over the deed in the fall of 1943. And at the last minute, Eleanor stood in for him, not a bad stand-in, of course, without explanation. Where was FDR? He was on a battleship, I think on the Iowa, heading for Iran for the summit with Churchill and Stalin. It was top secret. My priority would have been Roosevelt House, but this was saving the world. So he missed that opening. And by the way, nearly was killed on the way. A U.S. submarine was showing off torpedoes, and they were supposed to be using duds, and one torpedo man set off a live torpedo at the Iowa. And FDR said, he didn't say, help, or get me a life jacket. He said to his valet, take me to the port, I guess it was the port side, a starboard side, so I can see the torpedo. he was a Navy man, right? And the ship did some maneuvers, and I think it blew up in a wake. So we don't know what might have happened. And FDR pardoned the sailor who was court-martialed for letting off the live torpedo. Well, that brings us to today. Tehran is just a tiny part of this comprehensive character and historical analysis. And we're really happy to have Derek Liebart here. He's taught foreign policy at Georgetown for more than 2 decades and was the founding editor of the Harvard MIT journal International Security, also co-founder of the National Museum of the U.S. Army. This romantic lighting is not meant for him. I'm sure we'll get it fixed. Derek won I think that's probably a latecomer who leaned against the wall. Derek won the 2020 Truman Book Award for Grand Improvisation. America Confronts the British Superpower, 1945 to 1957. And he's written extensively on American foreign policy and military operations, and we're very happy to have him. Our interlocutor tonight is drawn from our own roster, I say kind of possessively, of FDR World War II experts who have presented here, although as he reminded me today, when I said, I'm not sure we've met, though we've done this program, he said, well, it was on Zoom, one of the many programs that we were fortunate enough to schedule during the lockdown. So we're very happy to welcome Scott Borchert back, who was last here online to present his book, Republic of Detours, How the New Deal Paid Broke Writers to Rediscover America, which won the inaugural New Deal Book Award. So our format is, as those of you who are regulars will know, we'll have a discussion of about 40 to 45 minutes, after which Scott will moderate a Q&A so that you can have your say with the author tonight. After which we do invite you upstairs to the historic Four Freedoms room for a glass of wine and an opportunity to get a signed copy of Unlikely Heroes. So with that, please join me in welcoming Derek Liebart in conversation with Scott Borchert.
All right, Derek, thank you for being here. My name is Scott Borchert. Really looking forward to our conversation tonight, and I want to say thank you to Roosevelt House for hosting this, and of course to Derek for being here to talk about his really excellent book. Unlikely Heroes, Franklin Roosevelt, his 4 lieutenants, and the world they made. I just want to say that I worked in the book publishing industry for a while before I started writing full-time, and I know how subtitles of books sometimes can make some very grand claims that don't always hold up when you actually read the book. But this is a book with a subtitle that really, proves the claim. They really are 4 remarkable people who helped shape our world through the New Deal and the World War II post-war era. And Derek really goes to great lengths to show how that happened in this book. So it's really a remarkable feat. I enjoyed it quite a lot. The book is a great story about these 4 lieutenants. They are, of course, Francis Perkins, Harold Ickes, Harry Hopkins, and Henry Wallace. And you tell the story so well. We get to know them reading this book. But I also got the sense reading it that you were trying to overturn some myths that historians have traditionally told about the Roosevelt administration, his cabinet, and these 4 people in particular. So I wanted to start out by asking you, what were some of these myths that people have been perpetuating about the administration, and why do you believe they are wrong?
More myths may surround the Roosevelt presidency than that of any other administration, which is understandable because the spotlight has always been on the Titanic leader himself, and much less so on his closest associates. We think of FDR, as do I, as the driving force who saved democracy during the 1930s and won World War II. But when we nudge the spotlight and we look at those closest of associates, whom I call the 4 lieutenants, we can get a very different picture of the presidency as well as of the character of FDR. The origins of so many of these myths are the iconic historians of the 1950s, the New Deal historians, such as Robert Sherwood, who wrote the Pulitzer winning Roosevelt and Hopkins in 1948-49, and Arthur Schlesinger Jr. with his own Pulitzer-winning 3 volumes on Roosevelt, and James McGregor Burns on FDR and leadership. These frame FDR correctly as the center of authority, as America's greatest pragmatic president. But they don't look a little deeper and a little wider on how the administration was led and how all this was accomplished.
So what were some of the other myths that you kind of found yourself running into when you were researching this book about Roosevelt himself, maybe about controversial aspects of his presidency?
One example that well, there are many, but the reason one can get a different picture of FDR himself is because these 4 closest associates at the very top of the administration, from the beginning in March 1933 until the very end in April 1945, they pooled their impressions continuously of FDR. So we can glimpse aspects of his character, many of them extremely admirable. Nobody was better at lifting up a wounded individual than was FDR, as he lifted up a wounded nation. It's worth noting that each of these lieutenants were as crippled, to use a term of the day. They were as crippled in their own way as was the polio-stricken president himself. And that was no accident. As Eleanor observed, Franklin enjoyed or felt most comfortable around outcasts. And each of these 4, as we can discuss, was physically or emotionally grievously crippled, as was his initial valet, who was crippled because his legs had been scalded in an industrial accident. So there are all these peculiarities of FDR. We know that he had a capacious intellect. I was struck by the sheer brilliance as attested to by Henry Wallace. 45 at the start of the administration, Wallace was Secretary of Agriculture, the biggest of government departments, and then would join the ticket in 1940 to be FDR's second vice president. Wallace himself was a genius by any diagnosis. The New York Times indeed called him a freak because of his, quote, freakish intellect. But Henry Wallace spoke not only as an equal with the great economist John Maynard Keynes and with Einstein, but he also spoke intellectually as an equal with FDR. They could discuss climate, geography, science. So the capacity of FDR's intellect was undeniable by looking at the pooled insights of the 4 closest associates. But then on the other hand, one sees less admirable traits, the petty cruelties, the manipulation, the ruthless self-centeredness. And there are several big reveals on that issue. FDR personally stopping the anti-lynching bill of 1940 when it was certain to pass the Senate that spring. This is a story we can discuss further. But for all the admirable aspects of FDR, one can see shortcomings of character that oftentimes went beyond that even of a politician.
Let me ask you, I want to jump ahead here. You have a great image in the book where you talk about Roosevelt discussing some issue, and there are almost like vote counting machines whirring in his mind while he's talking about this. He's known for having this kind of political calculation that influenced everything he did. That's why he was such a talented politician in some ways. These 4 people you discuss in the book, did they have that same sense of political calculation, or would you say they were more driven by ideas and their commitment to certain kinds of reforms?
These 4 lieutenants, each of them grievously wounded, each of whom he had plucked out of nearly nowhere even Frances Perkins, whom he had known the longest. Frances Perkins had remembered FDR from before the polio, when she described him as a tall, beautiful Greek god of a man vaulting over a chair. Each of these individuals were wounded in their own way, but they came together as a grouping by the end of 1933 as that cold, hard, enduring core of the administration. And they didn't have to worry about the vote counting machines in their head. They were all operators at the height of government, in the cabinet, in and out, but at the very top of the cabinet, which does not have to mean a oval-shaped mahogany table. A cabinet can be the center of political power. And they were the ones who executed and got things done for FDR.
So let's talk about those four specifically, because you really create these very moving portraits of them as complex, wounded, lonely human beings. Can you just kind of discuss them one by one and then talk about how these qualities kind of shape their time in office and what they did in Roosevelt's cabinet?
Yes. Now, let's put this in context. May 17th was a Wednesday, 90 years ago exactly. And about this time, 6:30, on that Wednesday, May 17th, FDR was wrapping up his day. He had balanced that schedule perfectly between domestic affairs and foreign policy. He had seen the Chinese ambassador and the Brazilian ambassador. He had also seen his Secretary of the Treasury and his budget director. As Frances Perkins discloses in her massive oral history, had it been up to FDR, he probably would have spent all his time on foreign policy, which he thoroughly enjoyed, had he not have to save the country. And in order to save the country, and I think it was nothing less during the New Deal, because there was violence on the political extremes of left and right that was just waiting to burst open. In order to save the country, he brought together this unusual power dynamic within his cabinet. Other than these four, the rest of whom he surrounded himself with in the formal cabinet of 10 were much less impressive. First was Harry Hopkins, 41 at the start of the administration in 1933, who would serve as de facto Secretary of Public Welfare, and then during World War II, the closest political military advisor that a president ever had. And Harry Hopkins, yes, he is long known to be a frail character, suffering grievously from ulcers. In 1937, having 3/4 of his stomach removed due to cancer. Less known about Hopkins is his extraordinary self-destructiveness, flushing his nutrients away, not taking his medicine, going on drinking binges whenever he began to recover. The irony is that the sicker Harry Hopkins got, the closer he was drawn to FDR. And during the war, Harry Hopkins' recurring near-death experiences became a source of his power. Second would be Harold Ickes, 58 at the start of the administration, a small-time Chicago lawyer who considered himself a has-been and a loser, as he described himself, in January 1933, before, in February 33, in this very House, being cavalierly appointed Secretary of the Interior. And Harold Ickes was bipolar by any diagnosis. There were days and days during his time in office that he literally could not speak. He kept himself going on Nembutal and whiskey, and he was a master administrator, even by the accounts of Robert Moses here in New York. And Harold Ickes built the Lincoln Tunnel, the Triborough Bridge, ran the enormous Public Works Administration, and then during the war, as I hope we get to see, was vital to victory in the distribution of 6 billion barrels of oil. Third lieutenant was Frances Perkins. Yes, the first woman in cabinet, the official in Washington who had known FDR the longest, 53 at the start of the administration. Frances was a self-invented, brilliant woman from Boston, of humble background in Maine, who redesigned herself as a Boston Brahmin, a brilliant graduate of Mount Holyoke in chemistry and economics, and a longtime social activist in the Settlement House movement who had worked for FDR during his 4 years as governor. Frances, however, would say that it pained her physically whenever she saw her picture in the paper. She had a near pathological insularity to her, and she had a tragic home life. Her husband was institutionalized for mental illness during nearly all of the 12-year presidency. Her daughter suffered as well from schizophrenia. She had an apartment right here on Madison and 89th that she loved and was reluctant, as Professor Holzer said, to leave it for Washington. She did not want her life spotlighted. She had what she called only 2 or 3 personal friends. First, it was Mary Harriman Rumsey, who died in 1934 in a riding accident, whom she had brought into the administration as the first consumer advocate. The second was Caroline O'Day, another very rich woman who was Congressman at large from New York and who died tragically in 1942. All of this, in the words of Harold Ickes, meant that throughout these 12 years, Frances, as he said, Frances was being beaten up badly. And as the first woman in the cabinet, she was also easy pickings for enemies in Congress. The fourth and final of the lieutenants is the extraordinary Henry Wallace, 45 at the start of the administration. Except for Perkins, FDR knew none of these men personally. Well, Hopkins slightly through Frances Perkins. But Wallace had been working on a startup that was making no money in 1932, doing hybrid genetic seed experiments. His family company, the Wallace Farmer periodical, well known in the Midwest, the Wallaces of Iowa, had already gone bankrupt and had been taken away out from under him. So Wallace in 1945 was known as a brilliant advocate of the heartland, of the devastating farm economics of the 1920s. But as FDR knew, he was also cornered. And Wallace's burden was that extraordinary intellect that kept him aloof from even those closest to him, including his children. But what makes all of the 4 lieutenants and FDR himself heroes, in my telling, is that despite all, they were able to overcome their grievous misfortunes and accomplish extraordinary things for the country and for the world.
So what was it actually like inside a typical cabinet meeting with FDR, the end of the table, and these 4 figures? What were the kind of interpersonal dynamics like between them?
Absolutely, Scott. One of the many, many myths about the Roosevelt presidency is that he did not use his cabinet, quote unquote. All historians reach that conclusion. To be sure, the cabinet was not a decision-making body. One didn't have votes in the cabinet except for a handful of times. And FDR used his weekly cabinet meetings on Friday at 2 p.m., as they would turn out to be for these dozen years. He used these cabinet meetings to think aloud and to draw on the opinions of those around the table. During the 1930s, an extraordinary vice president attended those cabinet meetings as well, and that was John Garner of Uvalde, Texas. John Garner has been written out of history because he didn't appear in the histories written by the iconic New Deal historians of the 1950s, and never has since. John Garner, with FDR's cooperation, of course, turned the vice presidency of those first two terms into an office as significant as it had been under Adams, Jefferson, and Burr. This was a formidable individual, 15-term congressman, briefly Speaker of the House, a ferocious enemy of the Ku Klux Klan. And when we wonder about how New Deal legislation zoomed through Congress during the 100 days that would not end until June 16th, 1933, we can look right at what John Garner accomplished. The cabinet meetings were mostly FDR talking, as he would do, thinking aloud, pinging people for their impressions, not to make decisions. Sometimes, as in the cabinet meeting right before Pearl Harbor, these meetings could be deadly serious. Other times, it could just be FDR having a good time with everyone deferential. It was often said that if you wanted to accomplish something serious with FDR, you wouldn't raise it in cabinet because that would be showing your hand to the other 9 around that table. You'd instead deal one-on-one with FDR or with his initial crippled secretary, Louis Howe, who would die at the end of the first term. So the dynamic of the cabinet was peculiar. It wasn't a board of directors by any sense, but it had within it this hard core of achievers who by the end of 33 were running a vast amount of the US government.
So let me ask, when people think about FDR and his advisors, a lot of people think of the Brain Trust, a famous, or Brains Trust maybe it was originally called, people like Rex Tugwell, these kind of intellectual advisors who maybe had a notable profile in the media and to historians, but perhaps weren't as influential as people kind of remember them to be. So how would you compare the Brain Trust to these 4 cabinet members?
Right, the Brain Trust were mostly professors from Columbia University who were drawn into the 1932 Franklin Roosevelt campaign. It was a relatively new initiative in US politics. That said, they did get much media attention, as Scott observed. Francis Perkins, who was a true insider, found them vastly exaggerated and found that term brain trust to be misleading. Indeed, we can seek where that term brain trust came from. It was initially used in the first decade of the 20th century in the Army General Staff as an insult for the big thinkers, and then it was repurposed in 1932. But Frances said she didn't take any of them seriously. They did not last long. Morley, Rexford Tugwell endured the first administration, and they were idea men, and they presumed to tutor FDR on issues of the day. Now, remember what we discussed just a few minutes ago. Here is FDR with this capacious intellect, a ravenous reader during the 1920s, especially when he was recovering, built an extraordinary library at his Springwood home in Hyde Park. And for the past 4 years, he indeed had been tutored, quote unquote, on public policy issues by the best of the best, which was Francis Perkins on domestic issues. On international matters, few people could surpass FDR's perspicacity. He spoke fluent French. His German was pretty competent. We know from Undersecretary of State Sumner Welles that he also read Spanish easily, and his Dutch was conversational. He had spent part of his childhood in Europe, and he was internationally oriented, harking back to his grandfather's day in the clipper trade with China. This was not a man in much need of being tutored, as the Brain Trust presumed, and to that end, by and large, they did not last long in the administration.
So Roosevelt had that famous phrase where he talked about the first part of his administration was Dr. New Deal, and then along came Dr. Win the War, right, when the Second World War kind of commenced. These four figures were really known for their emphasis on social and economic reforms. And I think you talk about in the book how they had a lot of, like Perkins especially, but they had a lot of plans already in place when they came into office. They sort of knew what they wanted to accomplish, and they did a lot of that. But then with the Second World War, everything changed. And so how did they respond to this new scenario? What kind of impact did they have, once the war began?
Yes, these four, under FDR's guidance, of course, built the great institutions of the New Deal. It's important to emphasize that a cabinet member of that time is not what it is today. A cabinet member was seen as a statesman during the 1930s. If you were in the cabinet, you were nearly a world figure. By and large, you'd be greeted with 19-gun salutes when you would visit a city. You were at the top of the list of protocol in Washington, paralleled only by justices of the Supreme Court.
Derek, excuse me, if you could talk into your mic a little bit more for the
Sorry.
Zoom. Sure.
So much was accomplished during the New Deal. But it's occurred to me that it would have been very difficult, and we were talking about this just before coming on stage, had it not been for the New Deal, which to this day is debated for its efficacy. It's really hard to see how America would have won World War II. Because what the New Deal did was not only create big government and vitally create big labor, but it also put in place the public-private partnerships with big business. And had there not been that alignment developed during the New Deal, big business, big labor, big government, it would have been really hard to see how we could have rallied so quickly to defeat the Axis. Each of these four had vital roles in winning the war. They were the counterpart of FDR's military foursome at the top. His chief of staff, Admiral Leahy, General George Marshall, Secretary of War, Chief of Naval Operations, and Hap Arnold, who ran the U.S. Army Air Force. These four were instead supreme on the home front. Harry Hopkins, as noted, was FDR's intimate political military advisor, and indeed FDR's eyes, meeting Stalin, meeting Churchill initially. Nobody was more persuasive in getting the United States into the war, revving up public opinion, than was Henry Wallace during 1940. Henry Wallace of Iowa, everyone knew he was of Iowa, an insular. And when Henry Wallace, Secretary of Agriculture, about to be vice president, when Henry Wallace of Iowa started talking about the United States and Europe being inseparable in their destinies, opinions began to change. FDR could not do that. Harold Ickes, who was known as a bruiser wanting to fight Germany, Japan since the mid-1930s, couldn't do that. Henry Wallace was decisive in moving the country toward war, and then in his great speech of 1942, Century of the Common Man, he laid out America's war aims. Harold Ickes, as Secretary of the Interior, had a massive remit. He was also, among so much else, the energy czar throughout the war. He controlled every single aspect of U.S. energy, of course oil, of course hydro, electricity, coal, all came under Ickes' command. And this was a brutal war that was fought by oil. The side that could get the most oil in the right spot was going to win. Its battleships, tanks, aircraft carriers, armored divisions. And it was Ickes who built on what had been achieved during the New Deal to get oil into the bunkers of destroyers, into Eisenhower's army in Europe at the right time and the right place. Perkins, in her turn, mobilized the female workforce to an extent that still is not understood. Historians mistakenly say that Perkins' role was diminished during the war, and that's merely repeating the biases of the 1940s. Yes, the head count in the Department of Labor was lessened as many of her staff were taken away to form these overnight wartime agencies, except so much of her staff still reported directly to Perkins. So Perkins set up military hospitals, for example, and spoke around the country about women getting into the workforce. To be sure, that did not mean women over 40, because 40 was the age where you could not be employed in Detroit if you were a man. And during the war, 40 was considered the cutoff point for getting women into factories and shipyards. But the older women, as Perkins said, which would be anyone above 40, could work in the canteens. And she brought everyone into the war effort. So here we have the four lieutenants, Hopkins, Harold Ickes, Perkins, Henry Wallace, being as indispensable to wartime victory as they were to saving democracy during the 1930s.
Let me ask you one quick question before we turn it over to the audience for a Q&A. I liked at the very end of the book, I think it might be in the acknowledgments, you mentioned a little story about your father. And I wonder if you could just tell that story really quickly and just tell us what lesson you took from that, and whether, was that kind of the starting point for you for your interest in this subject, or was that just something you kind of
Oh, that's kind of you to
tied up at the end?
mention that, Scott. FDR considered himself, above all, except being a Roosevelt of the Hudson Valley, he considered himself a Dutchman. And he would speak of Holland as the homeland. And foolishly, he's often seen as an Anglo-Saxon, and an Anglo-Saxon would be a strange way to describe someone named Delano Roosevelt. FDR had no affection at all for the British Empire. The notion that he had any kind of friendship with Churchill, and we can get into this, is completely loopy. That friendship was just one way, Churchill trying to ingratiate himself with FDR. But my father was able to escape in early 1941 from occupied Holland, and he escaped via Sweden, via Russia before the Nazi invasion of June 1941. He was able to get to Japan and then Hawaii. And when he arrived in San Francisco as one of the very few Dutch to escape under Nazi occupation, he had his first meeting with FDR in Washington. But the meeting that I note in my acknowledgments, FDR also had him up to Hyde Park On November 3rd, 1941, FDR was superb with young people. He could drop all of his manipulations and the political calculating machine in his head and be his best humored, most decent self around young people. And as he told my father, have no doubt, we will liberate the homeland, which was an evocative thing to say well before, well, Pearl Harbor being weeks away, but with no immediate prospect of America declaring war on Germany.
Right, and that sense of optimism really struck you.
The optimism, the genuine FDR in dealing with the young, in dealing with the injured, which is seen at Warm Springs. That is the best element of FDR in lifting up a wounded country.
Right, it's a really nice way to end the book, I thought, because there's so much human drama and strife going on in your account of him. So now we can turn it over to the audience if people have questions. I think I have to give you the microphone so you can speak to that. So just start, you over here, sir?
No, there's a mic.
Oh, there's a mic coming around. So if you just hold on a moment. Oh, I have some actually. Thank you.
There's so much to talk about FDR's administration. My question focuses on FDR's political perspective, his foreign policy perspective, how he was once the Assistant Secretary of Navy during World War I, and how the events at that time shaped his foreign policy perspective, especially when the Atlantic Charter was issued towards the British, obviously, and what was the process in this thinking at that time? I think his good neighbor policy towards Latin America, his relationship towards Asia and the anti-colonial movements. How was his relationship in the military transformed his thinking at the time?
You're entirely right. FDR was highly motivated to look at the world at a time when that was not customary for American politicians. He had been Secretary of the Navy, as you noted, during World War I, Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Assistant Secretary of the Navy, however, like a cabinet position, was not what it is today. Assistant Secretary of the Navy was the fourth most senior official in the defense apparatus of the United States. He had an initial encounter with Winston Churchill during those years, and he established relationships with the young rising naval officers who would serve at the heights under him during World War II. During the first cabinet meeting he had after the March 4th, 1933 inauguration, right on that agenda was Japan and Japan's predations in China. It's completely forgotten as well that when we speak about that extraordinary vice president, John Garner was sent to Tokyo in November 1934 to read the Riot Act to the emperor. This has been forgotten from history. Only Gerald Ford would be at the similar heights of politics to appear in Tokyo. The point being that FDR, who also, as we spoke of a bit earlier, had identified Hitler as a madman also from the get-go in 1933. Hitler had come to office as Chancellor of Germany in January 33. FDR knew right away, listening to him on the radio, understanding his German, being able to interpret his German for the rest of the cabinet, that Hitler was a madman. So the military expertise, the languages, the deft understanding of international affairs, it was very hard for any diplomat, any official in Washington to equal FDR. And therefore, the conclusion is that he was the most superb of warlords during the war.
So maybe you over there, sir?
For all of the great things that Roosevelt did and all of the brilliance that he had around him, there's one thing I cannot justify and the people I know cannot justify, and that's the 6 million that died with him taking no action to stop the Holocaust. Can you give us an insight into the thinking of the four and to Roosevelt during that time and why they did not bomb the railroad tracks?
I didn't get into that in the book. And what I did focus on is Roosevelt's view on Jewish immigration from 1938 to 1942. And it's nothing like in the Ken Burns documentary at all. One can be very concerned about FDR's shortcomings. And on the issue of refugees from Hitler, one can see him blocking time and time and time again immigration. The Ken Burns documentary blames it on the State Department, except FDR ran the State Department with an iron fist, even though he visited just once during his presidency. And the worst bigots at the State Department, such as Breckinridge Long, were FDR appointees, whom he could have fired on the spot. So one concern is the immigration issue on the cusp of America going to war. Harold Ickes, who was the official that Hitler denounced first and most severely in 1938, 1939, not FDR, Harold Ickes, who was a staunch advocate of immigration as he was for Black Americans, said that it wasn't the State Department. The gate was closed right in the White House. So that would be a failing number one. We can go into that further. FDR closed off Alaska. He closed off the Virgin Island to refugees, and he stood in the way many, many times. On the question of what he could have done by 1943, the worst, most tragic year of the Holocaust, historians, as you know, debate that. The FDR view, the prevailing view, was winning the war, winning the war. Others have debated about bombing rail lines. In the archives that I examined, the person among the four that would have been most responsible for handling those issues with FDR would have been his military political advisor, Harry Hopkins. And as we spoke about a little earlier before today's meeting, the Hopkins papers chronicle every detail of every day of FDR's presidency, except there are big gaps whenever it comes to discussing the slaughters of 1943, which were undeniable.
Where did Roosevelt go to restore himself personally? Talk a little bit about the relationship between Eleanor and Missy LeHand.
Yes. Missy LeHand, as the Roosevelt scholars and readers of his life know, was his secretary beginning in 1925 until she had her tragically crippling heart attacks in 1941. The women closest to FDR would have been Missy LeHand, faithful secretary. They would be his cousin, Daisy Suckley, and other women. The movies have made much of the Norwegian crown princess, and so on and so on. According to Messy LeHand, who knew him so extremely well, FDR was incapable of friendship in her telling, at least men friends anyway. He had adoring women around him who did perhaps restore him. But having an adoring cousin like Daisy Suckley would only take that emotional recovery so far. Daisy Suckley's memoirs, her diary, account for her visits to Hyde Park, her visits to the White House, her visits to Shangri-La, which is now Camp David. And what jumped out at me in her writings is hearing again and again during the night the screams from FDR's bedroom. And when she would ask the Secret Service about it the next morning, they'd say, oh, we're used to it. These were nightmares. And Scott had mentioned the epilogue, the end of Unlikely Heroes. When Frances Perkins and the Ickeys and the Wallaces were gathered together at the gravesite in Hyde Park on April 15th, 1945, what all remembered was the way that Frances Perkins said, God rest his soul. Frances Perkins, who knew him the best as a woman, believed he was a tormented, tortured soul within, despite the ebullience. And therein is heroism, because it takes a hero to overcome both the emotional and the physical torments that FDR had to endure.
All right, we can do one more question. You, sir?
Yes, thank you. You made a couple of points earlier that I'd like to have you respond to or perhaps elaborate on. In reading Elliot Roosevelt's book, As He Saw It, he goes through a description having witnessed a meeting between Churchill and Roosevelt nearing the end of the war, where Roosevelt was very clear to Churchill that the world would change at the end of this war, and that the British imperial 18th century methods would no longer be applied throughout the world. In other words, an end of colonialism. And the United States system, as Hamilton established and Roosevelt followed through with, would take hold throughout the world. And you could probably tell us more about the foreign relations and meetings that he had with world leaders, Brazil, and so on, to bring that truth, that same rebuilding system for peace that lasted in America throughout the world. Of course, Roosevelt died. I'll wrap up in a second. I think this is important, so thank you. I'll be right with you. Okay. Yes, I will. But, and then, of course, the Iron Curtain speech of Churchill, which launched the Cold War after Roosevelt's death. We're the only nation to ever launch any type of nuclear attack. So today, we stand something similar to the British influence. You've written about this, you know something about this, and the great British brain and the United States brawn. And we're now at a point where that type of intelligence can lead us into thermonuclear war with Russia and China. Can you tell me what your thoughts are as a person who studied this type of operations historically so that FDR's legacy can live on?
FDR and the lieutenants were confronting, then as today, America's altering role in the world. FDR believed that he would have more trouble with the British Empire after World War II than with Stalinist Russia. He grievously underestimated Stalin, for instance. But it would be a mistake to conclude that so much would have been different had FDR not been a casualty of war, as the War Department listed him that April 15th of 1945, because Stalinist predation was already showing its claws in 42, 43, and certainly by 45.
I'm going to just take host's prerogative and ask you a quick question, Derek. This is Eleanor's house as well. And we know that Eleanor was a strong backer of Frances Perkins, was her advocate in her ascent to the cabinet. Tell us whether Eleanor had significant relationships with the other three of the lieutenants.
Eleanor was very close with Frances Perkins, certainly during FDR's governorship. They would stay up late at night in the governor's mansion talking and gossiping. The difference is that Eleanor, during the presidency, was the strongest moral voice for humanity, whether the issue was race, whether it was Jewish immigration, whether it was downtrodden labor, whether it was the internment of Japanese American women. She was nearly a mythical figure. But unlike any of the other four, Eleanor didn't have the hands-on operational responsibility of getting things done. She was the president's wife. She could set the tone. The four, plus her husband, of course, would execute. She was also close for a time with Harry Hopkins, whom she eventually found far too sinuous, as he ingratiated himself with her husband by 1940.
My only other question is, Senator, is that you behind the mask?
Yes.
What an honor to welcome Bill Bradley. Thank you for coming. Well, thank you, Scott. Thank you, Derek. Lee Bart. Please come upstairs and join us for a reception and a book signing.